My family told everyone I failed. I sat quietly at my sister's governor's gala. Then her governor boss looked at me and whispered, "Wait. You're?" The room stopped. Even my mother couldn't speak. My name is Kenneth Reynolds, and for 38 years, my family has branded me the disappointment. The failure. The cautionary tale. Tonight, I sit alone at a corner table of Governor Blackwell's annual gala, watching my golden girl sister Rachel work the room. Nobody notices me in my simple black suit until the governor herself approaches, her eyes widening with recognition. "Wait, you're Senator Reynolds?" she whispers. My sister's face across the room drains of color as years of family betrayal collapse in an instant. If you've ever been underestimated by those who should believe in you most, stay with me. Let me know where you're watching from, hit subscribe, and find out how being underestimated became my greatest strength. Growing up as a Reynolds meant something in Boston. Our family name adorned buildings at universities, appeared in newspaper society pages, and opened doors that remained firmly closed to others. The Reynolds legacy was built on banking, business, and maintaining appearances at all costs. My parents, Robert and Elizabeth Reynolds, had very specific expectations for their children. Excel academically, attend an Ivy League university, pursue a respectable career in finance or law, marry well, and above all, never cause controversy. From my earliest memories, it was clear that my older sister Rachel embodied everything my parents hoped for in a Reynolds heir. She was beautiful, athletic, and charismatic with an easy charm that made her popular wherever she went. Rachel played by the rules and seemed to instinctively understand the unwritten social code of our privileged world. When Rachel brought home straight A's, my mother would beam with pride. When she became captain of the debate team, my father hosted an elaborate dinner party to celebrate. I was different. Not rebellious, exactly, but curious in ways that made my parents uncomfortable. Where Rachel accepted our family's worldview without question, I asked why. While my sister networked at country club events, I disappeared into books about history and government. My parents tolerated what they called my phase of intense intellectual curiosity, assuming I would eventually fall in line with family expectations. The first real sign of trouble came during my sophomore year of high school. My English teacher assigned a project analyzing a contemporary political issue. While most students chose safe topics, I selected a controversial environmental policy that directly opposed the interests of several companies connected to my family's investment portfolio. My research was thorough, my analysis nuanced, and my presentation earned the highest grade in the class. Instead of praise, my parents were horrified. "Do you have any idea how this makes us look?" my mother demanded that night, pacing our mahogany-paneled study. "The Harringtons were there, Kenneth. Their foundation is considering a major partnership with us, and now they think we've raised some sort of radical environmentalist." "But my research was accurate," I argued. "The data shows these policies are harmful. Isn't the truth important?" My father sighed, that familiar look of disappointment clouding his features. "Son, there's the truth, and then there's what's appropriate. You need to learn the difference." That became the pattern. When I joined the debate team instead of lacrosse like my father had, it was impractical. When I expressed interest in political science instead of business or pre-law, it was rebellious. Each choice I made that deviated from the Reynolds blueprint was treated as a personal affront to my family's legacy. By senior year, the contrast between Rachel and me couldn't have been more stark. She had already been accepted early decision to Harvard, following in our mother's footsteps. My sister moved through life with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned their path or purpose. Meanwhile, I found myself drawn to issues of social justice and political reform. I volunteered at a local campaign office, fascinated by the process of governance and policy creation. The campaign workers didn't care about my family name. They cared about my ideas and work ethic. For the first time, I felt valued for who I was rather than how well I conformed to expectations. When college application season arrived, I made a decision that permanently altered my relationship with my parents. Despite having the grades and legacy connections for an Ivy League acceptance, I chose to attend a well-respected state university with an exceptional political science program. The night I announced my decision, my mother's face flushed crimson. "You're throwing away opportunities people would kill for," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "This isn't just about you. This is about generations of Reynolds before you who worked to secure your future." "I'm not throwing anything away," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I'm choosing a different path." "A path to nowhere," my father interjected. "Political science? What does that even lead to? Government work? Campaigning for lost causes?" The University of Massachusetts campus couldn't have been more different from the ivied walls and exclusive clubs of Harvard. Here, merit mattered more than family connections, and diversity of thought was not just tolerated but encouraged. For the first time in my life, I felt free to explore ideas without the weight of familial judgment. During my first semester, I enrolled in a political theory course taught by Professor Diana Mitchell, a former legislative director who had left Washington to shape the next generation of political thinkers. From the moment she called on me in that first class, challenging my analysis of a Supreme Court decision, I knew I had found a mentor who would push me to think more deeply than ever before. "You have a natural instinct for policy analysis," Professor Mitchell told me after class one day, "but you need to learn to trust your voice. Your ideas matter, Mr. Reynolds." Those words, so simple yet so profound, were like water in a desert. No one in my family had ever suggested that my ideas mattered. They had only cared about how my ideas reflected on them. While I immersed myself in political theory and constitutional law, Rachel was thriving at Harvard. My parents' social media accounts featured endless photos of Rachel at business school events, Rachel networking with family connections, Rachel interning at prestigious consulting firms. Our paths couldn't have diverged more dramatically. During my sophomore year, I joined a campus advocacy group focused on educational equity. We organized peacefully, researched thoroughly, and presented data-driven solutions to university administration. When our efforts resulted in expanded scholarship opportunities for low-income students, I experienced a kind of fulfillment I had never known before. This wasn't abstract theory, this was creating tangible change in people's lives. My growing passion for advocacy made holiday breaks increasingly tense. What had once been subtle disapproval from my family had hardened into open dismissal of my interests and achievements. At Thanksgiving of my junior year, Rachel regaled the table with stories of her summer internship at a top consulting firm. My mother beamed with pride, asking detailed questions about Rachel's networking connections and mentors. "And what about you, Kenneth?" my Aunt Margaret asked during a lull in conversation. "Are you still doing that political thing?" Before I could answer, my mother interjected. "Kenneth is still finding himself," she said with a dismissive wave. "Hopefully, he'll get serious before graduation." I stared at my plate, swallowing both my response and my hurt. "Actually," I said quietly, "I've been offered a campaign position for Senator Warner this summer." The table fell silent until my father forced a tight smile. "How interesting. Will it pay well?" "It's about the experience, not the money," I replied. My mother scoffed. "Experience doesn't pay student loans, Kenneth." My first apartment after college was a far cry from the Reynolds family estate. A fifth-floor walk-up with unreliable heat and a shared bathroom, it was all I could afford on my nonprofit salary. Each month was a financial tightrope walk, juggling student loan payments, rent, groceries, and the professional wardrobe required for political work. The apartment itself told the story of my choices. Second-hand furniture from garage sales, a laptop balanced on a makeshift desk constructed from milk crates and plywood, and a refrigerator that hummed so loudly I often worked with headphones on. My neighbors were graduate students, struggling artists, and young professionals like myself who had chosen passion over paychecks. For the first time in my life, I felt part of a community that valued purpose over prestige. Meanwhile, Rachel had graduated with honors and immediately stepped into a six-figure position at a prestigious law firm. Her Instagram showcased business-class flights, luxury apartments, and networking events with Boston's elite. My parents made sure everyone in their social circle knew about Rachel's meteoric rise. They would frame her law school graduation photo prominently in the living room while my college diploma remained tucked away in a drawer. The contrast became even more stark during family holidays. Rachel would arrive with stories of high-profile cases, expensive client dinners, and partnerships with influential firms. She had already purchased a downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and granite countertops. Her walk-in closet held more designer suits than I owned clothing altogether. "Kenneth's still pursuing his nonprofit work," my mother would explain to relatives with the same tone she might use to describe a persistent illness. "We're hopeful he'll transition to something more stable soon." The voter education nonprofit where I worked was chronically underfunded but vitally important. We developed educational materials about the electoral process, conducted registration drives in underserved communities, and worked to increase civic participation among young voters. The hours were long, the pay was minimal, but the work felt meaningful in ways I couldn't fully articulate to anyone who hadn't experienced it. My colleagues became my chosen family during those lean years. Maria, our program director, had left a lucrative consulting career to focus on voter outreach. David, our communications specialist, could have been making triple his salary in corporate PR but believed in our mission. Together, we formed a tight-knit team united by shared values rather than shared bank accounts. Our office was located in a converted warehouse space we shared with 3 other nonprofits. The heating was inconsistent, the carpet was stained, and the coffee machine required percussive maintenance to function properly. But within those humble walls, we were changing democracy one voter at a time. When we successfully registered 10,000 new voters in a single month, our celebration consisted of pizza from the discount place down the street and beer from the convenience store. It felt more meaningful than any champagne toast at a corporate event. The personal cost of my career choice became increasingly apparent. Dating was complicated when potential partners learned about my financial situation. I remember one particularly painful dinner where a woman I'd been seeing discovered I couldn't afford to split the check at the restaurant she'd chosen. Their expression of pity and disappointment haunted me for weeks afterward. I began declining social invitations, partly from financial necessity but also from the emotional exhaustion of constantly explaining my career choices to people who measured worth solely through salary figures. Family gatherings became exercises in endurance. At my cousin's wedding, I overheard my father explaining my career choice to a family friend. "Kenneth is still in his idealistic phase. Working for some voter thing. We're hoping he'll come to his senses soon." Later that evening, my uncle Robert cornered me at the bar. "You know, Kenneth, I have connections at several major firms. One phone call and you could be making real money." This nonprofit thing is noble, but you can't build a future on good intentions. I appreciate the offer, I replied carefully, but I'm building something important where I am. He chuckled condescendingly. Important to whom? Your bank account certainly doesn't think so. The lowest point came during my second year at the nonprofit. A funding crisis threatened to shut down our entire operation. Our largest donor had pulled out unexpectedly, leaving us scrambling to cover basic operational costs. For 3 months, our staff worked without pay, hoping we could secure emergency funding to keep the doors open. During this crisis, I seriously considered my uncle's job offer. The corporate position would solve my financial problems immediately. I could afford a decent apartment, reliable transportation, maybe even start paying down my student loans aggressively. The temptation was overwhelming, especially when I received an eviction notice due to late rent payments. I called Rachel that night, swallowing my pride to ask if she could loan me money for rent. Her response was swift and brutal. Kenneth, this is exactly what we've all been trying to tell you. You can't sustain this lifestyle. Mom and Dad aren't going to bail you out forever, and frankly, neither can I. It's time to grow up and get a real job. This is a real job, I insisted, though my voice lacked conviction after months of financial stress. A real job pays enough to live on, she replied. A real job is benefits, security, a future. What you're doing is charity work with a fancy title. After hanging up, I sat in my dark apartment, the electricity had been shut off that morning, and wondered if everyone was right. Maybe I was being naive. Maybe idealism was a luxury I couldn't afford. Maybe it was time to abandon my principles and accept that success meant wealth accumulation, not social impact. The next morning, I walked into our struggling office, prepared to submit my resignation. But before I could speak, Maria burst through the door with news that changed everything. A national foundation had approved our emergency grant application. Not only would we survive, but we would have funding to expand our programs significantly. Kenneth, she called out, seeing me in the doorway. We did it. We're not just surviving, we're going to thrive. And it's largely because of your policy analysis in the grant application. They specifically mentioned your section on democratic participation metrics as a deciding factor. In that moment, I realized that my family's definition of success, measured in dollars and status symbols, was fundamentally incompatible with my own. I had found work that mattered, colleagues who valued my contributions, and the possibility of creating lasting change. The financial struggles were real, but they were temporary obstacles, not permanent verdicts on my worth or my choices. The successful grant application marked a turning point in both my career and my confidence. My policy analysis skills, which my family dismissed as impractical, were precisely what had saved our organization. I began to see my unique perspective, shaped by academic rigor and real-world experience, as a strength rather than a liability. Over the following months, I threw myself into expanding our voter education programs. I developed innovative curriculum materials that made complex political processes accessible to first-time voters. I created partnerships with community colleges to integrate civic education into their general studies programs. Most importantly, I began documenting the measurable impact of our work. The data told a compelling story. In communities where we conducted intensive voter education campaigns, civic participation increased by an average of 18% over baseline measurements from previous comparable elections. Young voter turnout in our target districts exceeded national averages by significant margins. Perhaps most meaningfully, we tracked how many of our program participants went on to volunteer for campaigns, attend town halls, or even run for local office themselves. This documentation proved crucial when local media began covering voter turnout trends and sought expert commentary. An investigative reporter named Jennifer Walsh reached out to interview me about our organization's measurable impact on recent election results. Her resulting article, The Quiet Revolution: How Local Advocacy is Reshaping Democratic Participation, featured my photo and quoted extensively from our conversation about civic engagement strategies. The article caught the attention of several state-level political figures, including Congresswoman Sarah Martinez, who invited me to provide written testimony for a subcommittee on election administration. My detailed policy analysis, submitted as part of the formal record, demonstrated expertise that elevated my professional standing significantly. My family's reaction to the congressional recognition was tellingly muted. While the local paper covered my policy contribution with the headline "Local Advocate Advises Congress on Voting Rights," my parents made no mention of it during our monthly obligatory phone check-ins. Rachel, to her credit, sent a brief text, "Saw the article about Congress. Impressive." It wasn't much, but it was acknowledgement. The professional recognition opened new doors. I was invited to present at national conferences on civic engagement. Academic researchers began citing my work in their papers on voter behavior. Most importantly, other nonprofit organizations and political campaigns started seeking my consultation on voter outreach strategies. These opportunities supplemented my nonprofit salary enough to move to a better apartment, still modest, but with reliable heat and my own bathroom. The financial improvement came from consulting fees and speaking honoraria, not salary increases, but it represented meaningful progress toward stability. More significantly, they established my reputation as a legitimate expert in my field, not just an idealistic volunteer playing at politics. During this period of professional growth, I reconnected with Professor Mitchell, who had been following my career with interest. She invited me to guest lecture in her political science courses, where I found unexpected joy in teaching. The students' questions challenged me to articulate not just what I believed, but why I believed it. Their energy and optimism reminded me of my own early passion for political change. You have a gift for making complex ideas accessible, Professor Mitchell told me after one particularly engaging class discussion. Have you considered running for office yourself? The suggestion initially struck me as premature. I was finally finding stability and recognition in my current role. Why risk that by entering the uncertain world of electoral politics? But the seed was planted, and I found myself observing local political dynamics with new interest. The idea gained momentum when our city council passed a controversial ordinance limiting nonprofit voter registration activities. The restriction was clearly aimed at organizations like ours, designed to suppress civic participation under the guise of preventing voter fraud, a problem that existed more in political rhetoric than in statistical reality. I testified against the ordinance, presenting data that demonstrated the baseless nature of the alleged fraud concerns. My testimony was passionate but grounded in research, earning praise from local activists and newspaper editorial boards. However, the council passed the restriction anyway, largely along partisan lines. Walking out of that council meeting, I felt the frustration that comes from watching elected officials ignore evidence in favor of political convenience. That night, I called Logan, whom I had begun dating seriously after meeting him at Professor Mitchell's recommendation. I keep thinking about what Professor Mitchell said, I told him. About running for office. Maybe the only way to change these systems is from within. Logan, who had been working in political communications for several years, understood both the appeal and the challenges. It's a big leap, he said carefully. Campaign work is brutal, especially for someone without family, money, or connections. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and stress? I'm prepared for the work, I replied. The question is whether I'm prepared for my family's reaction when I announce I'm running for the same city council that just restricted our voter education efforts. His laughter was knowing. They'll probably think you've completely lost your mind. But Kenneth, you've been preparing for this your entire career. You understand policy, you know how to work with communities, and you have actual data on what makes democracy work better. That's more qualification than most candidates bring to the table. The conversation continued late into the night, exploring the practical realities of a campaign, fundraising timelines, ballot access requirements, media strategy, volunteer coordination. By dawn, the decision felt inevitable rather than impulsive. I wasn't running for office to prove anything to my family or to advance some abstract political ambition. I was running because I had seen democracy work at the grassroots level, and I wanted to bring that same energy and integrity to institutional governance. The announcement would come later, but that night marked the true beginning of my political career, not the moment I filed papers or gave speeches, but the moment I committed to translating years of community organizing into electoral engagement. Everything I had learned about listening to constituents, building coalitions, and creating evidence-based policy solutions would finally have a platform for implementation. The months leading up to my announcement were filled with careful preparation and strategic planning. I spent weekends walking through every neighborhood in the district, listening to residents' concerns about city services, development pressures, and quality of life issues. These conversations, unfiltered by campaign promises or political positioning, gave me invaluable insight into what actual governance required. I discovered that effective local politics was less about grand ideological statements and more about practical problem solving, making sure streetlights worked, that snow removal was equitable, that small business permitting processes were transparent. My background in policy analysis proved remarkably relevant to these seemingly mundane but essential functions of city government. The turning point came during a community forum our organization had arranged. A young single father approached me after the event, his eyes bright with purpose. Before your program, I never voted, he told me. Never thought it mattered for people like me. Now my son sees me researching candidates, filling out my ballot. He knows his voice will matter too someday. That's because of you. His words restored my wavering faith. This was why I had chosen this path, not for wealth or status, but to help people recognize their own power in our democracy. Around this time, I met Logan Mitchell at a political fundraiser. Logan, whose mother Professor Diana Mitchell had been my mentor, worked as a communications director for a progressive state representative. Tall with thoughtful green eyes and a quick mind, Logan was the first person who seemed to truly understand my passion for political work without questioning its validity. So you're the famous Kenneth Reynolds, he said when Professor Mitchell introduced us. My mother says you're going to be governor someday. I laughed off the compliment, but something about Logan's genuine interest in my ideas made me feel seen in a way I rarely experienced. Our first date stretched into a 5-hour conversation about electoral reform, community organizing, and our shared vision for a more inclusive democracy. With Logan's encouragement and my growing network of political connections, I made a decision that shocked everyone who knew me. At 29, I would run for city council. With no family support and limited finances, it seemed like an impossible goal. But I had built strong relationships in the community through my nonprofit work, and I understood the issues facing ordinary citizens in ways that many politicians didn't. When I told my family about my candidacy, their reactions were predictably dismissive. City council? My mother repeated, as if I'd announced plans to join the circus. Kenneth, be serious. I am serious, I replied. I've already filed the paperwork. This is embarrassing, my father said flatly. You'll lose, waste what little money you have, and then what? Have you thought this through at all? Actually, I have a campaign manager, a treasurer, and a growing team of volunteers, I explained, trying to keep my voice even. We've developed a solid campaign strategy focused on community engagement. Rachel, who had recently begun working for rising political star Governor James Blackwell, looked uncomfortable. Politics is more complicated than you realize, Kenneth, she said. It's not just about good intentions. I'm well aware, I replied, biting back a sharper response. It was typical of my family to assume I was naive rather than consider that I might actually be qualified. My grassroots campaign was nothing like the big budget operations I would later encounter. We operated out of a borrowed office space, relied heavily on volunteers, and focused on direct voter contact. I knocked on thousands of doors personally, listening to residents' concerns and sharing my vision for more responsive local government. The night of the election, Logan and I gathered with our small team at a neighborhood restaurant. When the results showed I had won by a narrow margin, the room erupted in cheers. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of politics, but it felt monumental. My phone remained silent that night. No congratulations from my family, despite the fact that the local paper had covered my win. When I finally received a text from Rachel the next day, it was characteristically backhanded. Congrats on the council seat. Small pond, but I guess it's a start. My mother's eventual response was similarly qualified. We're surprised by your win. The district must have had a very low threshold for candidates. Their inability to acknowledge my legitimate achievement only strengthened my resolve. I would prove my worth not through their measure of success, but through effective public service that improved people's lives. My first term on the city council was a crash course in practical governance. I quickly discovered that effective public service required more than good intentions. It demanded strategic thinking, coalition building, and a thick skin. I threw myself into the work, focusing on initiatives to increase affordable housing, improve public transportation, and create more transparent city government. By the end of my first term, I had successfully championed several significant policy initiatives that improved daily life for my constituents. Local media began to speculate about my future political prospects, suggesting I might be well positioned for higher office. When a state senate seat in my district unexpectedly opened after my second term on city council, a coalition of community leaders and progressive organizations approached me about running. At 33, after careful consideration and many long conversations with Logan, who had become not just my partner in life but my most trusted political advisor, I decided to enter the race. Despite being outspent and facing established political opponents, my grassroots campaign resonated with voters tired of business-as-usual politics. On election night, when the results confirmed my victory, I allowed myself a moment of pure vindication. I had achieved this without family connections, without family money, without family support. My first term in the state senate proved transformative. Rather than grandstanding or pursuing headline-grabbing initiatives, I focused on the unglamorous but essential work of crafting sound legislation. I developed a reputation as someone who did his homework, asked insightful questions, and could work across partisan lines to achieve practical results. By my third year in office, I had successfully sponsored 12 bills that were signed into law, a solid achievement for a first-term senator from the minority party. My effectiveness drew attention from national party leaders searching for talent to develop for higher office. Meanwhile, Rachel's star continued to rise alongside Governor Blackwell's. My sister had fully embraced her role as the governor's right hand, appearing frequently in state media as the administration's spokesperson. Our parents' social media accounts regularly featured photos with Rachel and the governor at official functions, their pride unmistakable. The unexpected opportunity arose during my fourth year in the state senate. Senator Margaret Walsh, who had represented our state in Washington for 3 terms, announced her retirement due to health concerns. The timing created a special election with compressed campaigning timeline and national implications for party control of the Senate. When party leadership approached me about running, at age 37, my initial reaction was hesitation. A U.S. Senate campaign would mean intense scrutiny, not just of my political record, but of my personal life, including the family estrangement I had largely kept private. After days of deliberation, I made my decision. I would run, but with an unusual strategy. I would keep a deliberately low media profile, focusing on substance over personality and retail politics over splashy events. The campaign required a level of discipline and focus unlike anything I had previously experienced. I immersed myself in policy briefings, participated in small community forums rather than large rallies, and authorized my team to decline most national media requests. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in June, elegant cream-colored cardstock with embossed lettering. Governor James Blackwell requests the honor of your presence at the annual Governor's Gala benefiting the Children's Education Foundation. No personal note, just the formal invitation that presumably went to hundreds of political and business leaders across the state. I stared at it, knowing immediately that Rachel had to be involved in the guest list. As Blackwell's chief of staff, my sister oversaw such events. Was this an olive branch? A political calculation? Or simply an oversight, my name included on a list of elected officials without anyone realizing the family connection? Are you going to go? Logan asked that evening, finding me still contemplating the invitation at our kitchen table. I don't know, I admitted. It feels like walking into the lion's den. Maybe it's time, he suggested gently. You've proven yourself beyond any reasonable doubt. You're a United States Senator, Kenneth. Maybe seeing you in that role will finally break through their denial. After days of deliberation, I decided to attend. Not to seek approval or reconciliation, but to represent my office with the dignity it deserved. The night of the gala, I chose a simple but elegant black suit, understated yet appropriate for the formal occasion. Logan, handsome in his tuxedo, squeezed my hand as our car approached the venue. Remember who you are now, he whispered. United States Senator Kenneth Reynolds. You've earned your place here. From across the room, I observed Rachel in her element, leaning in to whisper something to Governor Blackwell, laughing at appropriate moments, the perfect political lieutenant. She had not once looked in my direction, though she surely knew I was there. Lost in thought, I didn't immediately notice when a hush fell over our corner of the ballroom. Looking up, I found Governor Blackwell himself approaching our table, flanked by aides and security. Rachel trailed slightly behind her, her attention on a notepad rather than the room. The governor stopped directly at our table, her eyebrows raising slightly as she focused on me. For a moment, confusion crossed her features before recognition dawned in her eyes. Wait, you're Senator Reynolds? He asked, his voice low but clearly surprised. The table went silent. Behind her, Rachel's head snapped up, her face draining of color as she realized what was happening. I stood, extending my hand professionally. Yes, Governor. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Thank you for including me this evening. Governor Blackwell clasped my hand warmly, his initial surprise transforming into genuine interest. The education bill author. Your work on the Federal Education Committee has been remarkable. I had no idea you would be joining us tonight. From the corner of my eye, I could see Rachel frozen in place, her professional mask slipping to reveal naked shock. Around us, conversations had hushed as people strained to observe the interaction. I've been meaning to discuss your healthcare access proposal, the governor continued, seemingly oblivious to the building tension. It aligns with several initiatives we're considering at the state level. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting while you're in the state. I would welcome that, Governor, I replied, maintaining my composure despite the growing whispers around us. It was then that Governor Blackwell glanced back at Rachel, who had finally approached, her face now composed though still notably pale. Rachel, why didn't you mention that Senator Reynolds would be attending tonight? We could have arranged a proper welcome. A flash of something, panic, embarrassment, crossed my sister's face before she recovered. An oversight on my part, Governor. My apologies. The governor turned back to me, her brow furrowing slightly. Reynolds. Is there a relation? The surname isn't that common. Before I could respond, Rachel stepped forward. Senator Reynolds is my brother, Governor. Governor Blackwell's surprise was evident. Your brother? I had no idea you had a brother in the Senate. He looked between us, clearly reassessing some internal narrative. Why haven't you ever mentioned this? The moment hung suspended, the nearby tables now openly watching the drama unfold. Rachel's career, built partially on our family connections and reputation, suddenly faced a complicated public revelation. Family and politics can be complex, Governor, Rachel offered weakly. Indeed they can, I interjected smoothly, saving her from further explanation. But ultimately, we all serve the public in our own ways. As the governor moved to the next table, Rachel and I were left in an awkward tableau, years of estrangement condensed into a single public moment. Kenneth, she began, her voice low. I didn't know you would be here. Clearly, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Though as a U.S. Senator from this state, it would be unusual to exclude me from the invitation list. That's not what I meant, she said, discomfort evident in her stance. We should talk. Not here, but soon. Should we? I asked, meeting her gaze directly. After years of silence? After our parents have actively misrepresented my career to everyone in their circle? What exactly should we talk about, Rachel? The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and conversations. Political leaders who had barely acknowledged my arrival now sought me out. Business executives expressed interest in my committee work. Through it all, I maintained my professional demeanor, neither gloating over the revelation nor appearing affected by the years of family rejection it had exposed. As Logan and I finally prepared to leave, Governor Blackwell approached once more, this time without Rachel in tow. Senator Reynolds, she said quietly, I hope you'll forgive my ignorance earlier. Had I known of your relationship to my chief of staff, I would have ensured a more appropriate welcome. No apology necessary, Governor, I assured her. Family circumstances can be complicated. He nodded thoughtfully. Indeed. Though I must say, having observed your work in the Senate, particularly on education reform, I find myself questioning the narrative I've heard about you through certain channels. You're clearly an exceptional public servant. The revelation at the governor's gala created ripples that extended far beyond that single evening. By the next morning, several state political blogs had picked up the story of the Reynolds siblings' reunion, complete with speculation about our family dynamics. 3 days after the gala, my office phone rang with a number I instantly recognized but hadn't seen on my caller ID in years, my mother's private line. "Kenneth," she began without preamble when I answered. "I understand you attended the governor's gala." "I did," I replied, keeping my tone neutral, as would be expected for a senator from the state. There was a pause, the silence heavy with unspoken history. "Your father and I have been discussing recent developments. We feel it might be appropriate to have dinner while you're in the state. To clear the air." The careful phrasing wasn't lost on me, not an apology, not an admission of wrongdoing, merely an acknowledgement that circumstances had changed. My new position made me someone they could no longer dismiss or ignore. Over the following months, there was a gradual, cautious reconnection with my family. Holiday gatherings remained somewhat strained, but there was genuine effort on all sides. My mother made a point of asking about my legislative priorities. My father, in his own awkward way, began occasionally forwarding articles about my work with brief notes of approval. Rachel proved more complicated but also more genuine in her attempts at reconciliation. We began meeting occasionally at a coffee shop in the state capital, neutral territory where we could speak privately without the weight of family expectations. In these conversations, she admitted to years of complicity in our parents' narrative about my failures, acknowledging that she had known it wasn't accurate but found it easier not to correct them. The deepest lesson of my journey wasn't about politics or even family, but about authenticity. By refusing to conform to others' definitions of success and worth, I had discovered my own. The path had been harder, lonelier at times, but ultimately led to a life aligned with my values rather than someone else's expectations. Looking back now, I see that being underestimated was indeed my greatest strength. It forced me to rely on my own judgment, to build resilience, to find value in myself rather than in others' approval. Those qualities served me well not just in politics, but in the more fundamental human challenge of living an authentic life. Sometimes our greatest strengths emerge from our deepest wounds if we're brave enough to forge our own path through the pain. True success isn't measured by others' standards, but by the courage to live authentically according to your own values, even when those closest to you can't see the worth in what you're building. The boy who was once dismissed as the family disappointment had become Senator Reynolds, not in spite of being underestimated, but because of it. And that transformation, hard-won and authentic, was worth more than any approval I might have received by conforming to a path that was never truly mine.